My husband calmly told me he wanted a divorce, then handed me his lawyer's number like I meant nothing. Stick with me while I share my story, and if it touches you, don't forget to support our channel by hitting that subscribe button, dropping a like, and sharing it with the people you care about. I'm Rachel Miller, and until that moment, I believed I was living a normal, stable life. Daniel and I had been married for 14 years. We weren't perfect, but I thought we were solid. We had routines, shared responsibilities, and a quiet understanding that comes from building a life together over time. Daniel worked as a corporate consultant, and I always respected how focused and driven he was. I supported his long hours, his business trips, and the stress that followed him home. I believed that was what partnership meant. The day he told me he wanted a divorce felt unreal. There was no argument leading up to it. No big fight. No warning signs that screamed something was wrong. We were sitting at the kitchen table like any other evening. He didn't raise his voice or look upset. In fact, he was strangely calm. That calmness scared me more than anger ever could. He said, "I think it's best if we end this," as if he were talking about canceling a subscription. Then he slid a piece of paper across the table. It had a lawyer's name and phone number written neatly at the top. He told me I should contact him to make things easier. That was it. No explanation. No apology. No emotion. I felt like the ground disappeared under me. I kept waiting for him to say more, to explain what went wrong, or at least to show some sign that this was hard for him too. But he didn't. He just sat there, confident and composed, watching me process something that had just shattered my world. My mind raced through years of memories. I wondered if I had missed something important, if I had ignored signs that now seemed obvious. I searched his face for guilt, sadness, or hesitation, but I saw none. Instead, there was certainty. It was as if he had already moved on emotionally and was simply informing me of a decision that had been made long before that night. What hurt the most was how prepared he seemed. This wasn't a conversation. It was a plan. The lawyer's number wasn't a suggestion, it was a step in a process he had clearly thought through. Meanwhile, I was still trying to understand how my marriage had reached this point without me even realizing it. As I sat there, holding that piece of paper, a quiet feeling settled in my chest. Something wasn't adding up. Daniel's confidence didn't come from relief or honesty. It came from knowing something I didn't. And in that moment, through the shock and pain, I realized this divorce wasn't just sudden. It was calculated. When I looked back at our life together, it was hard to match those memories with the man who had just asked for a divorce. We lived in a quiet suburb in Illinois, the kind of place where neighbors waved, lawns were trimmed every weekend, and nothing ever seemed out of place. Our days followed simple routines. Mornings were rushed but familiar. Evenings were calm, often spent eating dinner at the table and talking about work or small plans for the weekend. I truly believed we had built something steady. Holidays were always important to me. I planned them carefully, wanting our home to feel warm and welcoming. I hosted family dinners, wrapped gifts early, and made sure traditions stayed alive. Daniel usually smiled and thanked me, even if he seemed tired. I told myself his exhaustion came from work, not from us. I believed that love didn't always need big gestures. Sometimes it was just showing up every day and staying committed. There were sacrifices I never thought twice about at the time. Years ago, I was offered a promotion at my job. It meant more responsibility and better pay, but it also required longer hours and some travel. Daniel was already traveling often for his work, and he said it would be difficult if we were both gone so much. After many conversations, I turned the promotion down. I convinced myself it was the right choice for our marriage. I told myself there would be other chances. As time went on, Daniel changed in small ways. He wasn't mean or angry. He didn't shout or insult me. That almost made it harder to notice. He became quieter, more distant. Conversations felt shorter. He spent more time on his laptop or answering work calls. When I asked if everything was okay, he always said yes. I believed him because I wanted to. I started questioning myself instead. I wondered if I wasn't interesting enough anymore, or if I talked too much about unimportant things. I tried harder to be supportive, to keep the house calm, to make his life easier. I thought maybe this was just what long marriages looked like. Comfort instead of excitement. Routine instead of romance. Slowly, guilt settled in without me realizing it. I felt responsible for the distance between us, even though I didn't know what I had done wrong. I told myself I should have been more patient, more understanding, more grateful. I never imagined that while I was blaming myself, something much deeper was already breaking beneath the surface of our marriage. A few days later, I sat in a quiet office across from a man named Mark Holloway. He was polite and professional, the kind of person who spoke carefully and chose his words with purpose. This was Daniel's lawyer. Walking into that office felt strange, like I was stepping into a story that didn't belong to me but somehow controlled my future. Mark explained the process in a calm, practiced tone. He already had files laid out on his desk, neatly labeled and organized. As he spoke, I realized how detailed everything was. There were financial records, dates, and notes about property and expenses. It felt less like a first conversation and more like a continuation of something that had been discussed many times before. As he went through the paperwork, I noticed how familiar he seemed with our lives. He knew timelines, account balances, and even personal details I hadn't expected him to mention. It became clear that Daniel hadn't just walked into his office recently with a sudden decision. This had taken time. Planning. Thought. At one point, Mark paused and corrected himself mid-sentence. He mentioned something about how Daniel had been preparing for this for a while, before quickly moving on. He didn't mean to say it, I could tell. The words slipped out, and once they did, the air in the room changed. My stomach tightened. That single sentence explained everything Daniel hadn't. I sat there quietly, listening as Mark continued outlining next steps, but my mind was somewhere else. I thought about the nights Daniel came home late, the moments he seemed distracted, the way he avoided deeper conversations. I had assumed stress. Now I saw intention. This wasn't a decision made in a moment of frustration. It was something he had been working toward while I was still trying to hold things together. When the meeting ended, I walked out into the parking lot feeling unsteady. The world around me looked the same, but I felt completely different. The shock wasn't just about the divorce anymore. It was about the realization that I had been left out of my own marriage long before it officially ended. As I drove home, one thought stayed with me. Daniel hadn't just decided to leave. He had prepared to leave, quietly and carefully, while I was still living in the present. And that realization hurt more than the divorce itself. After that meeting, I couldn't sit still. I needed answers, even if I didn't know exactly what I was looking for. One evening, when the house was quiet, I started going through old paperwork we kept in a storage box in the closet. It held years of bank statements, receipts, and insurance files that I had never felt the need to question before. At first, nothing stood out. Then I noticed small things that didn't make sense. There were withdrawals I didn't remember approving and transfers to accounts I didn't recognize. The amounts weren't huge, but they were consistent. Enough to catch my attention. I checked dates and compared them with our calendar. Some of them lined up with Daniel's work trips. I dug deeper. I found travel receipts that didn't match the trips he had told me about. Hotels booked for longer stays than necessary. Flights that were changed at the last minute. Meals charged for 2 people when he had said he was dining alone. Each detail felt small by itself, but together they formed a pattern I couldn't ignore. I thought back to moments that had confused me before. Times when Daniel came home later than expected or seemed distracted during phone calls. I remembered how he sometimes stepped outside to take calls, lowering his voice. When I asked simple questions, his answers were always smooth but vague. I had accepted them because I trusted him. Then I found a name I didn't recognize at first, Lauren Whitman. It appeared in a few places, tied to shared expenses and meeting notes. As I looked closer, I realized she was someone Daniel had mentioned casually in the past, a professional contact he worked with occasionally. He had never given me a reason to doubt that explanation. Sitting there on the floor, surrounded by papers, the truth slowly settled in. This wasn't just about money. It was about deception. The pieces came together in a way I couldn't deny anymore. Daniel wasn't only leaving the marriage. He had already stepped outside of it. What hurt most wasn't just the betrayal itself. It was how easily he had lied, how naturally he had carried on our life while hiding something so serious. I trusted him completely. I defended him in my own mind whenever doubt tried to surface. Realizing that trust had been misplaced left a deep, quiet ache that words couldn't fully describe. After everything I had uncovered, my first instinct was to confront Daniel and demand the truth. I wanted to shout, to cry, to force him to admit what he had done. But something inside me told me to stop. I realized that reacting emotionally would only give him control. So I chose silence instead. I became careful with my words and my actions. At home, I kept conversations neutral and brief. I watched more than I spoke. I paid attention to what Daniel said and what he avoided. The calm on my face didn't match the storm inside me, but it gave me space to think clearly. For the first time since all this started, I wasn't acting on pain alone. Without telling Daniel, I scheduled a meeting with my own attorney. Her name was Evelyn Brooks. She was known for being direct, quiet, and thorough. Sitting in her office felt different from the first lawyer meeting. Evelyn listened without interrupting, taking notes while I explained everything I knew. She didn't rush me or soften her words. She focused on facts. As we went through the details of my marriage, Evelyn asked questions I hadn't considered before. She wanted to know when assets were purchased, whose name was on certain accounts, and how money had moved over the years. When I explained that many of our financial decisions were made during the marriage and often with joint effort, her expression changed slightly. That was when she told me something that surprised me. Daniel's confidence wasn't backed by the legal advantage he seemed to think he had. Because of how our assets were built and managed, I had more rights than he likely expected. His preparation didn't erase the years I had invested in our life together. Hearing that didn't bring instant relief, but it gave me something important: balance. I wasn't powerless. I didn't need to beg or plead. I had options, and I had time. Evelyn reminded me that patience mattered just as much as evidence. I left her office feeling calmer than I had in weeks. I was still hurt, but I wasn't lost anymore. I understood that this situation didn't require emotional explosions. It required clarity and control. And for the first time since Daniel asked for the divorce, I felt steady enough to move forward on my own terms. From that point on, I focused on being careful and precise. I didn't rush anything. I started organizing what I had found, placing documents in order and noting dates and amounts. I followed the money calmly, tracing where it moved and when. Every detail mattered. I kept everything private and secure, sharing it only with Evelyn. At home, Daniel seemed relaxed. He spoke casually about the process, as if the outcome was already decided. His confidence grew each day. He treated me like someone who didn't understand what was happening, like I was simply going along with his plan. I let him believe that. I didn't challenge his assumptions or ask questions that might raise suspicion. Whenever something didn't add up, I wrote it down. Timelines became clear when I placed events side by side. Trips, payments, and changes in behavior lined up in ways that couldn't be ignored. There was no emotion in the process anymore, just facts. I wasn't trying to punish him out of anger. I was protecting myself. Evelyn reviewed everything carefully. She explained which details were most important and which ones to leave alone. She helped me understand how the law worked in my favor when it came to shared assets and undisclosed accounts. There were no dramatic moves, no threats sent through lawyers. Everything was done quietly and correctly. Daniel never noticed the shift in control. He continued acting as though I was behind, unaware of how prepared I had become. That false sense of security worked in my favor. While he focused on moving forward, I focused on making sure nothing was hidden or overlooked. The power of what I was doing didn't come from confrontation. It came from patience. Every step was measured. Every decision was intentional. I wasn't seeking revenge in the way people imagine it. There were no raised voices or public scenes. What I was building was stronger than that. By staying calm and following the rules, I was setting the stage for a result Daniel didn't expect. Not because I wanted to hurt him, but because I refused to be underestimated. In silence, I was reclaiming control over my future, one careful step at a time. The day of the formal meeting arrived quietly. There was no drama leading up to it, no last-minute messages or arguments. We sat across from each other in a neutral room, with lawyers on both sides. Daniel looked relaxed, almost bored, as if this was just another step he expected to pass easily. When it was time to speak, I didn't rush. I stayed calm and steady. I didn't accuse or raise my voice. I simply addressed the facts. One by one, my attorney presented the information I had gathered. Dates were mentioned. Amounts were clarified. Accounts were identified. The room grew quieter with every detail. At first, Daniel tried to maintain his composure. He nodded as if none of it surprised him. But then his posture shifted. His jaw tightened. He stopped making eye contact. I could see the moment when he realized this meeting wasn't going the way he had imagined. When the subject of undisclosed funds came up, he looked genuinely caught off guard. The confidence he had carried for weeks began to fade. His responses became slower, less certain. For the first time, he wasn't in control of the conversation. I watched him carefully, not with anger, but with clarity. He knew I understood more than he had assumed. Not just the numbers, but the pattern behind them. He saw that I wasn't confused or emotional. I was informed. There was no argument between us. The shift happened in silence. He realized I had seen through the manipulation and preparation he thought were hidden. Everything he had counted on staying unnoticed was now clearly laid out. By the end of the meeting, the balance between us had changed. Daniel no longer looked ahead with certainty. He looked unsettled, as if the ground beneath him was no longer solid. I didn't feel satisfaction in his discomfort. I felt calm. That was the moment I understood something important. Strength doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it appears quietly, when someone finally realizes they misjudged the person standing across from them. After that meeting, Daniel tried to approach me differently. His tone softened, and he spoke as if we could somehow reset things emotionally. He hinted at regret and suggested that maybe we could talk things through in a more personal way. I listened, but I didn't engage. The time for emotional explanations had passed. I made it clear, calmly and without bitterness, that reconciliation was not an option. I wasn't interested in apologies that came only after consequences appeared. I didn't argue or remind him of what he had done. I simply stayed focused on the process ahead. Letting the law handle everything felt cleaner and more honest than revisiting wounds that could never fully heal. I didn't seek to embarrass Daniel or damage him publicly. I didn't need to. The truth was already doing its work. As the legal process continued, it became clear that the outcome wouldn't match the future he had planned for himself. Financial decisions he thought were secure were now under review. Agreements he expected to favor him had to be reconsidered. The losses came quietly but firmly. He had to give up more financially than he had anticipated. The confidence he once carried into professional spaces weakened as his situation became harder to explain. People who had trusted his judgment began to see him differently. Control, the thing he valued most, slowly slipped away. Lauren also faded from the picture. There was no confrontation, no final conversation that I knew of. She simply stopped appearing in his plans. When the stability he had promised disappeared, so did her presence. What remained was the reality he now had to face alone. Throughout it all, I stayed steady. I didn't celebrate his losses or take pleasure in them. My focus wasn't on punishment. It was on closure and fairness. Watching everything unfold, I realized that consequences don't need cruelty to be effective. Sometimes the most powerful response is stepping back and allowing the truth to stand on its own. When the divorce was finalized, there was no celebration and no dramatic ending. It was a quiet moment marked by paperwork and signatures. Still, it felt like the closing of a long chapter. I walked out of that process knowing it was truly over, and for the first time in a long while, I could breathe without feeling weighed down. I moved into a smaller home not far from where I had lived before. It wasn't as polished or impressive, but it felt peaceful. Every room belonged to me. I arranged the space slowly, choosing what stayed and what no longer had a place in my life. Letting go of things felt symbolic, as if I was clearing more than just physical space. Life became simpler. My days followed a rhythm that was my own. I made decisions without checking in or adjusting to someone else's expectations. I rediscovered how capable I was on my own. The quiet moments, once uncomfortable, became grounding. Over time, I started to recognize myself again. Not as a wife trying to hold everything together, but as a person with her own strength and clarity. I trusted my instincts more. I respected my boundaries. The self-doubt that had followed me for years slowly faded, replaced by a calm confidence I hadn't known I was missing. Looking back, I understood something important. Revenge doesn't always come with raised voices or dramatic gestures. Sometimes it's simply living well after being underestimated. It's choosing peace over chaos and dignity over anger. What stayed with me most was the lesson that silence and patience can be powerful. I didn't need to prove anything to anyone. The justice had already happened, and healing followed naturally once I allowed myself to move forward. Sitting quietly in my new home, I often thought about everything that had happened. The shock, the betrayal, the careful planning, and finally, the calm reclaiming of my life. It was a lot to process, but in reflection, I realized how much this experience had taught me about myself and about dignity. Daniel didn't just walk away from a marriage. He walked away from someone who trusted him completely, someone who had believed in him without question. That trust was priceless, and the way he broke it left a mark. But I also understood that my value wasn't defined by his choices. Betrayal hurt deeply, but it didn't have to define me. I could choose how I responded, and I chose clarity and self-respect over anger and bitterness. Looking back, I see that patience was my greatest ally. I didn't rush to react, and I didn't let my emotions control the process. Instead, I observed, planned, and acted with care. That patience allowed me to see the full picture, to understand what had really been going on, and to protect myself without losing my integrity. Truth was another powerful lesson. I faced the facts of what had happened, no matter how painful, and used them to guide my decisions. I didn't distort reality or hold on to illusions. Understanding the truth helped me regain control and made every step of the process feel purposeful. And most importantly, self-respect guided me through the darkest moments. I didn't compromise who I was to appease Daniel or anyone else. I set boundaries and honored them. I didn't need to humiliate him or create drama. By holding on to my dignity, I quietly shifted the balance of power back to myself. The moral I want to share is simple: sometimes, the person who walks away believes they've won. They think their plan is flawless and that the other person is powerless. But patience, truth, and self-respect have their own kind of strength. They can turn a situation around, quietly and completely. In the end, I am free, not just from a marriage that no longer worked, but from fear, doubt, and the need for validation from someone who didn't value me. Life moves forward, and I move forward with it, stronger and wiser. Betrayal left scars, yes, but it also left lessons. And the most important one is this: no one can take your dignity unless you let them. Sometimes the ending isn't about revenge or punishment. It's about reclaiming your life, standing tall, and showing that strength doesn't need to be loud to be undeniable. That's what I learned, and that's what I want anyone going through a similar pain to remember.